people don't want to pay more for water unless they understand the value of what they're gaining for the additional money. But we did a meeting in each ward of the city, and we did it in locations picked by the ward council members. And we would bring every office of DC Water into the room. Can I present to you, the audience, that we are doing better this year than we did last year? Then we show an actual bill before and after, hiding nothing. This is what the bill looks like. And that process, people start to understand, we're here, we're you, we serve you. And that, I think, worked. It was part of that change of rebranding, connecting to the customer. And we got those rate increases approved, and we're able to do projects that fundamentally have changed the environment and the services that people in Washington, D.C. deserve and gain from its local utility.
Prominent CEOs, leading economists, iconic investors, insights from the experts. The Walker Webcast with Willy Walker. See who's next.
Welcome to another Walker Webcast. It's my great joy to have my old friend George Hawkins join me today. George and I worked very closely together at what used to be called the DC Water and Sewer Authority, which he and I rebranded DC Water. And this webcast will get into both the transformation process that George so successfully led at DC Water. We're going to go kind of back and forth on a couple of the, if you will, battle wounds and scars the two of us both endured and were able to move beyond during that period of time, and talk a little bit about water more broadly in the United States and around the globe, water systems. And if there's anyone who knows a lot about water utilities, and some of the issues our country faces as it relates to water systems, it's George. So, George, first of all, thanks, buddy. It's great to see you.
Fantastic to see you, Willie. And that was a very kind introduction. As you and I know from public meetings, whenever anyone's introducing me and they're not swearing, say good start of the day. But and it's very kind of you to say it was led by me. We had a team, which you were very much part of, that we could not have accomplished the goals we did without so many different elements working together to a common end. So I very much felt you were a key, and as did everyone on the team. You were such an important part of that success. And it's a story. I'm actually sitting in State College, Pennsylvania. I did the opening here for a big water conference, and I told the DC water transformation story. It's still a story that people are interested in and what they could learn from. And they have as much to learn from you as they do from me.
Well, I will refute that statement all day long, but let's wind the clock back for a second here, George. You're a Princeton undergrad, Harvard Law School graduate, someone who's exceedingly well educated, also a wrestler by training, which I think says a lot about you and your personality. But you were running the DC Department of the Environment for Mayor Adrian Fenty when you and I first met. And I was asked by Mayor Fenty to come in as chairman of the board of the DC Water and Sewer Authority. For a moment, let's wind the clock back to DC Sewer and Water Authority at the turn of the millennium, 2000, 2001, and the lead issue, which had made its way to the front pages of the Washington Post and done a lot of damage to both the DC Water and Sewer Authority reputation, as well as lawsuits that were saying we need a change here. Because I think that it's important to understand that as the backdrop as you and I talk about the transformation that we led at DC Water and some of the things that we were up against. Talk for a moment about the lead scare. And when you joined the board, being on the board of the DC Department of the Environment, what you saw from that seat rather than from the seat I actually put you in.
Sure. And it's such a great look back, because The last thing I ever expected to be was the general manager of DC Wasa. And it was, I don't know if you remember this. And by the way, for those of you listening, this is one of the reasons I give such respect to Willie. When he agreed to come on the board of a huge, important organization, I remember reading at the time a Washington Post article that ranked DC Wasa as the worst customer service agency in Washington, D.C. And think on that one for a while. I mean, of all agencies there, DC Wasa is at the bottom of it, which is one of the reasons
we're both smart enough to find really low bars to jump over. That's that's the key to both of our success, is find the lowest bar to jump over.
Well, that's why one of the reasons that your friend Adrian Fenty selected you, and ultimately that you selected me, is he had been a ward-based council member and realized how terrible the customer service he received when he ever contacted DC Wasa. The other challenge is the one you mentioned. The worst lead crisis in the United States prior to Flint was in DC. And the irony was, it wasn't because the agency was trying to do something wrong. They were changing the treatment process. I won't go into all the gory details, but it was to reduce something called disinfectant byproducts. When you have put chlorine into the pipes that deliver water to everybody's homes who are listening to this podcast, to clean the pipes along the way. And they switched to a new disinfectant, trying to reduce a byproduct that is not good for people. What they did not know is that caused the scaling that kept lead from leaching in the water to dissipate, and they had a huge lead crisis. So it wasn't a bad thing that had triggered it. The challenge DC Wasa had is, in the old days, DC Wasa didn't communicate with people. It was a terrible customer service agency, and it didn't tell people. It didn't tell people on time. So the story in the Washington Post is that not only had the agency done a step that polluted the water and put kids at risk, they didn't tell anybody, and they weren't open and transparent about it. And so there was article after article, as they said in the old days, Willie, above the fold on the front page, about DC Wasa being this organization that was poisoning your kids. So when Willie was selected to be board chair by Adrian Fenty, and then eventually several steps down the road, I was selected as GM, it was an agency that was in real tough shape. And I regulated. This is the irony to me. Most of the people running water utilities have engineering and science background. I'm a lawyer by training. I never worked for a utility before. I'd only ever sued them, regulated them, and agitated about them, including that one. I regulated DC Wasa and wasn't particularly friendly because they were not particularly friendly in return. It was a very combative organization back then, as you remember, Willie. So I guess the backdrop of that is there was a huge mountain to climb when you agreed to come on as board chair. And then when I started contemplating, at the request of Mayor Fenty, of whether I would apply to become GM, of what this challenge was in front of us and the scale of it, it was pretty daunting at the time.
Start a legacy. Start turning dreams into realities. A better world begins with you. Better communities start with us.
I think one of the interesting things, George, that I think back on is that we hired a third party, one of the big headhunting firms, to do a national search for the new general manager of DC Water. And it was Mayor Fenty who said to me, you ought to take a look at George Hawkins. And with now hindsight and incredible just thanks and respect and awe in what you did in the GM role. When Adrian first said that to me, I said, you mean George Hawkins, who's like he's a member of the board. He kind of comes in and out of meetings. He's kind of antagonistic to us because the environmental regulator is kind of on our ass about everything. And I have to say, when he first mentioned your name, I was like, why would we think about that? We need to go find someone who understands water systems, whatever else. And what I found to be so interesting as I thought about it, and what Adrian putting your name forward made me think about, was what was the real thing that ailed DC Water or DC Wasa at that time, in the sense that, as you rightfully outlined, wasn't a matter of the capability of the management team from getting the water to the consumers. It wasn't a matter of whether the pipes were running, if you will. So from an actual water system standpoint, it was working well, obviously barring the change from chlorine to chloramine back in 2000, which caused the leaching. but that had clearly been corrected. And as I sat there and thought about your candidacy, one of the things that I realized was we at DC WASA had lost all credibility with the environmental community, which was putting a huge amount of pressure on DC WASA to change things. The second thing was we weren't communicating with our clients well, and you were a master communicator. And the final thing was it was more of a branding / leadership need than it was a technical / engineering need in that role. And hindsight's 2020 vision. I would have never had the expectation that you would have led the transformation that you led. But in hindsight, it is very interesting to think of what I initially thought we needed in that role, what Adrian suggesting you made me think about. And then when we actually put you in that role, the magnificent transformation that you were able to enact. Because quite honestly, you didn't come from a water systems, here's the engineering, here are the pipes, let's go do that, but much more from a PR, general management, general leadership perspective. And then also with the bona fides from having been on the environmental side to be able to meet and engage with the environmental community to say, hey, hang on a second, there's a new sheriff in town. We take these issues very, very seriously. Give me some time. We're going to focus on them.
I'm not surprised that when you first saw my name as candidate, that was not obvious that it would be that I would be a good selection. I wasn't a particularly involved board member, and that was actually for a reason. When you're a member of a board, you've got a duty of care to the enterprise. But my core job was being the environmental regulator of that enterprise. And I thought those roles were a little bit in conflict. So that's why, in truth, I was not an active board member as I could have been. And I always had felt this conflicting two roles that bumped into each other. The change that came to me, Willie, which was similar to you had the question as the person hiring, and for me as someone applying, like, do I want to do this job, given all the things I don't know about water utilities? And the change that came over to me, which was really quite dramatic when I thought about it, is that I always thought of DC WASA and every other treatment plant. I'd regulated many over the years. I've been an EPA enforcement lawyer, all the rest. I've had these jobs as a polluter. A polluter is the one person you regulate and you hold them responsible. What I realized as I thought about the job is DC WASA is not a polluter in the same way that a company that makes a product that has pollutants as a byproduct has to pay for the cost of those pollutants, so it's internalized in the price of the product. Instead, DC WASA was taking everybody else's pollution and on their behalf, cleaning it and then putting it back where it came from in the first place. The water comes off the Potomac, you clean it, we send it around the city, we take it back and put it, it's a recycling, the original, largest and most important recycling program in the city and the most important environmental service done for the nation's capital. And that literally was an epiphany for me that transformed, and this was the process of applying my perspective on DC WASA, where I started with, do I really want to do this job, to, oh my gosh, what you could do at the reins of an enterprise like this, thinking of it as an environmental organization and seeing what difference you can make for the city in which you reside, which happens to be a city that gets the kind of visibility that DC does.
So a couple of things that listeners ought to understand as it relates to DC WASA and the board and the role you were stepping into, just as a little bit of background. DC WASA is the public utility that has a board that's made up of 11 permanent members and 11 alternate members. So it's a 22-person board. It is also a board that is made up of all the constituencies sitting around the DC metropolitan area. So there are board members from Montgomery County, Prince George's County, Fairfax County, Loudoun County, and the District of Columbia. So if you think about a board that has, if you will, distinct interests at hand around the table, DC WASA at that time, now DC Water, could not have a more, let's just say, challenging board composition, because everyone isn't pulling on the same oar. Every one of those different, and oh, by the way, all of those people who were on the board were elected officials. They were elected in Montgomery County or appointed to the board by an elected official in Montgomery County, Prince George County. So you had Maryland, DC, and the Virginia as three separate states. Then you also had different people who were either appointed or elected officials who sat there. And every word that they said in a DC Water Board meeting, which, by the way, are all webcast live and recorded, so there are no secrets, could and will be used against them in their next campaign or when the person who appointed them to the board is up for re-election. So it was a very, very challenging board structure. And inside of that, as general manager, you had a chairman of the board who, by the way, just talking about governance, I will say that if this ever makes its way to any public official who's thinking about redoing some type of board, having someone from the private sector be able to sit as chairman of that board is exceedingly important. The DC Water Board had elected officials as chairmen prior to me. And I don't think that allows for the chairman or chairwoman to be able to move the enterprise in the way it needs to go. If you have an elected official from DC sitting in that seat, all of the constituents from Maryland and Virginia look at you as sort of the enemy to some degree, or at least not working on their behalf. And so I would just say that I had the luxury of being from the private sector sitting in that role that allowed me to do some things like go and bring in a new general manager that someone who was in an elected position on that board, I don't think would have had the ability to do. The other thing that I think is important for people to realize is that DC Water is is it the largest wastewater treatment plant in the United States, George, or is it? I know it's a top.
What I would say is two things. One, the reason I give so much credit to you happily is because the board structure was such a challenge. And if we had not had the relationship with you and your leadership on the board, all of these good things we were able to do would not have happened. It was an absolute, both are significant. And yes, the treatment plant that DC WASA is responsible for is the largest advanced wastewater treatment plant on Earth. There is no bigger one anywhere on the planet. Although I did use the word advanced, again, without going into all the details, in most treatment plants, there's primary treatment, there's secondary treatment. That's what almost every treatment plant has. Only a few have tertiary treatment, which is a very advanced level, and it takes up a lot of geography. So the plant is the largest advanced treatment plant that has all three of those steps. And there's an interesting story behind that relates to Eisenhower and worries about all sorts of things. But 750 square miles around DC, all of that flow goes to one giant plant. And when you would chair a board meeting, that's where we would sit. We would be at Blue Plains looking out the window to the treatment plant in the background. It was amazing.
I remember it pretty neat. The one other thing, George, that I think is important for people to understand is the infrastructure as it relates to sewage and how sewage is collected in an old system like DC has and like many cities on the East Coast have versus more Western cities that were developed later on that separated runoff with sewage. You want to just talk that through for a second so
Sure.
people understand why DC Water was set up the way it was?
I mean, what was fascinating about the transformation, and Willie's absolutely right. Early on, the most important change was a connection to the people we served, a sense of customer service, and a sense of environmental stewardship in an agency which hadn't had those attributes. But what I learned when I got there, and I remember joking about this to myself early on in my tenures, I hadn't really realized this, is that the issue, which I'll come back to in a moment, of what Willie just asked me about, the nature of the sewer system in DC, which is similar to 855 cities in the United States, is there's a solution to that problem. And I'll come back to that, but it costs in total now $3.2 billion. And 2009, which is the year you selected me to be GM, was the first year and the first contract starting on that $3.2 billion project. And in parallel to that, there was another $1 billion project to improve Blue Plains for nutrients to the Chesapeake Bay. That's $4.2 billion, by far the largest public expenditures in the mid-Atlantic. And this agency that was disliked and distrusted by the customers it was served, we were supposed to raise that kind of revenue with the people we were serving. And that was just that's why this transformation started with outreach. But what we embarked on, and Willie, you helped champion some of the most far-reaching projects on this, is not only a good relationship, but what could we do at the utility to reduce costs, to generate revenue, to do all these innovative strategies to have at this enormous challenge of all this huge financial projects that were obligated. This is not discretionary; these were mandated. Really quickly on your
yeah. I was just going to jump in there real quick because I think there's a piece to the story that people need to understand, which is just that the DC sewage system was developed back in a time where the designers thought that you could have runoff off the streets and sewage that came out of houses, and it could all come together into what is called a combined sewage system. And back in the day, in the old Tabard Creek used to run in front of the U.S. Capitol, and literally the Tabard Creek would take the human sewage from Capitol Hill, from the U.S. Capitol, as well as the runoff down Pennsylvania Avenue, and it all comes together and it flows down the Potomac River and goes to Blue Plains, and it got treated. Unfortunately, as the city grew, those pipes would get to a point where they would overflow. You would have a rain event, and the rain off the streets would combine with the sewage coming out of the homes, and you get this big backup. And that backup would come out of the sewage system, and it would pour into the Anacostia River and into the Potomac River. And that would raise pollution levels in the Potomac River to levels that were unsafe for humans, unsafe for the environment. So the Justice Department sued DC WASA and put DC WASA under a consent decree to build capture tunnels that would allow for this combined sewage to be basically stored in these capture tunnels. And that's the $3.2 billion that George just talked about. And then once the storm event passes, the sewage would be pumped out of the capture tunnels and into Blue Plains, treated in Blue Plains, and then put back into the Potomac River as clean water. And so when George came in, that consent decree was put on DC WASA before I became chairman of the board, but we were planning on getting going on the building of these capture tunnels right as I came in as chairman of the board. On top of that, George just underscored the $1 billion that we needed to invest into reducing overall effluents out of the sewage treatment plant. And then there's another project that George and I got to in a moment that I think is also a very interesting one as people think about capital expenditure. How do you pay for all this? And then what do you need to do with the customers at the same time? One of the key things that you did so well, George, I was in awe of was, yes, we had the ability to raise rates, but those rates always were under public scrutiny on an annual basis. And if you didn't have the support of the community, you would never get those rate changes through. What do you think the most successful thing that you and the management team did to be able to get the community to accept the rate increases that we put through at that time to pay for all of this?
Sure. But by the way, for all of you listening, what anyone now that is in the water sector as much as I am, we seek a board chair that can talk about combined sewers with the accuracy and understanding that really,
as you well know, when the Washington Post is listening to every word you say to try and put something on the front page, you better be damn clear on what you're talking about. But go ahead, jump on.
It was great to have a board chair, but I'll tell you something.
Yeah,
I want to do public sector, but one thing I do want to go back to is that when you were selected as a private sector business leader as chair of the board, and I come in as a lawyer, I think there was a real strength to the fact that neither of us came in with any preconceived notions about what was possible. I remember the prior board chair of DC Water, and they were sort of like a debating society between all these interests with no clear need or what's the drive, what kind of projects. And if it wasn't exactly what public sector agencies always do, why would we try that? As opposed to the reverse is, what should we do? And sort of having an open mind of all these new things that could be tried that maybe weren't common in this sector. And you and I were able to do that in part because we didn't have any preconceived notions. And I thought that was a really powerful part. And then you brought this perspective, we should be doing things to run more efficiently and more effectively for our ratepayers, which links to your question. So we did raise rates. My first year, that 2009, 2010, we raised rates 18%. And then it was faster than inflation every single year thereafter. So that by the time I stepped down from the board, we had tripled rates in Washington, D.C., which is sort of mind boggling. I remember people saying to me saying to us that would never happen. And what was remarkable to me is we got every one of those rate requests approved unanimously by a board that could often be contentious. And the question is, what do we do differently? And it's a good lesson here for public agencies. In the old days, this is prior to our time at DC WASA, you were required by administrative law to have 2 hearings. And I don't know if you remember, Willie, they were in that building behind Union Station.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody could find. I remember where I had to go as a board member, and I remember walking around and around until I could find the place. And they'd have a hearing covering their administrative legal requirement, and maybe 20 people would show up. This is of the enormous service area. And that was considered a victory because you'd have checked off the boxes. You can get your approvals. And then the first time any customer sees the increase is when they get a bill. And my reaction to that is, well, you can do that once or twice, but in a context of needing to raise rates from here till as far as we could see in the future, that's not going to work. People are going to rebel, as they should, about all these rate increases that they have no idea what's going on. What's this for? Why should I pay this? By the way, Willie, I always get a kick out of the surveys where there's a survey and people don't want to pay more for water. They want to pay more. Who calls someone and asks them if they want to pay more? And we would say, yes. No one's going to answer that question, yes, unless they understand the value of what they're gaining for the additional money. So what we did, as Willie well recalls, because he was there at many of them, is we disbanded we still did the 2 formal ones that you had to do by statute, but we did a meeting in each ward of the city. And we did it in locations picked by the ward council members. So this was schools, rec centers, places that people know about and could attend. And we would come into the community, invite everybody, not passively, everybody to come visit. And we would bring every office of DC Water into the room. And I would make a presentation. Like, when have you ever met the head of one of your infrastructure agencies? I'm standing in front of you in your rec center. And I always felt, Willie, I had to make 2 main presentations cases to the audience. And the first is one that's very private sector oriented, but not common in the public sector, but no reason why it can't be done, which is, can I present to you, the audience, that we are doing better this year than we did last year by measures that you will understand? It used to cost us $5 to treat this, and now it costs us $3. It used to cost us $1,200 in man hours to replace a fire hydrant, and now it costs $1,000. You have to prove to you that we are using your money better this year than last year, which is why the continuous improvement of performance, which you helped us orchestrate, was such an important. If I have proved that to you, that opens the door to the second case I have to make, which is we need more money. And I need to prove to you that that's meaningful to you, that this is the best dollar you can spend for Washington, D.C. And that's my case. I have to present to you why that's true. And at the end of those 2, then we show an actual bill before and after, hiding nothing. This is what the bill looks like. And here's why we think it's the best investment you can make. Then we open it up to questions. And if I couldn't answer it, or someone in the room couldn't answer it, we would answer it in 24 hours. And that process, people start to understand, gosh, by the way, well, I'm not sure you remember this. One of our overlays of our capital program was to make sure we did projects in every ward, because I wanted every ratepayer so I could say in those meetings, yes, we're doing all these good things for here, there, but in your ward, there's a map back in the room here that shows exactly the projects we are doing in your neighborhood that matter to you. And that's what your money is going for. You're not just, this is not money going and disappearing to some agency you don't understand. We're here. We're you. We serve you. And that, I think, worked. It changed the dynamic. It was part of that change of rebranding, connecting to the customer. And we got those rate increases approved, and we're able to do projects that fundamentally have changed the environment and the services that people in Washington, D.C. deserve and gain from its local utility.
It sounds easy in the way that you just outlined it, and it makes perfect sense in hindsight. People need to understand that what you just outlined it wasn't even, there wasn't a conversation about having that type of outreach prior to you coming to DC WASA. I remember distinctly You first of all told me you were going to do those meetings. And I was like, man, you got some strong skin. You got some tough skin. And then the second, I remember you one night, you called me at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. You'd been in one of these meetings for 3 to 4 hours and you had just gotten, I mean, people weren't throwing tomatoes at you, but I mean, they were throwing verbal tomatoes at you the entire night. And you came out and you just said, "Ooh, that was a seriously heavy lift." But that's leadership. That's retail politics, George. One of the things that I find to be so incredible about this transformation process is it obviously takes a lot of different things. It does take getting the board behind you. It does take leadership at the board level. It does take getting the right general manager. It does take getting leadership in your team to say, this is where we're going to go. All those things can come together. But unless you're willing to roll up your sleeves and do the blocking and tackling, and what in this role is really kind of retail politics that you led, and willing to put yourself out there. I mean, I hear you talk about it now, George, and I sit there and go, yeah, in hindsight, it sounds like it was kind of pretty easy to do. It wasn't easy at all.
Oh.
And as you were saying that, what was so interesting is you say it now because your future and your job doesn't depend on it. But at the time, your success, my success, our collective success as a team was dependent on going and meeting with those constituents, talking to them, hearing their disappointment, their inability to pay rate increases, all the things that you had to deal with to convince them that this was what we needed to do. And on the backs of that and the rate increases we were able to push through, you then turned to me and said, let's issue a 100-year bond. So talk about that for a moment, because given that I'm in the finance world, the fact that we did the first 100-year bond with Goldman Sachs when you were running DC WASA, to this day, and also given where rates are today, every single person listening right now wishes that they'd done a 100-year bond at the rates that DC WASA issued paper. So talk for a moment about that, because the rate increases were an instrumental piece to us being able to go out and raise long-term debt financing, because they could see the P&L growing and the ability for us to take on that debt on a 100-year term and be able to service it.
Sure. And as you remember, Willie, I give tremendous credit for the 100-year bond. We did an environmental impact bond, which is the first that ever been done. A variety of, because we had Mark Kim as our CFO, who I felt was the best CFO in the business, is now running the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board. So he's gone on to quite the role. But what happens, and I will absolutely answer your question, but what I felt, yes, I had 3 police officers with me in those meetings, and some of them were very tough. But I actually felt they were meaningful because many of the comments that were being made were fair. I'd be mad if I were you. And if we don't hear it, we can't respond. And then someone's angry out there just saying bad things, which only gets worse. But I talked to the general manager, someone called me the next day and they're now working on it. It's amazing, that transformation, and usually not hard things. It's just in the old days, they couldn't get anyone to respond to them. But it also, when I had the issue, Willie, of trying to build a rapport with a team. I'm a Caucasian guy lawyer, and most of the staff at DC Water are African-American veterans who are like, who is that person? And it was amazing the loyalty I built from my team. It wasn't why I did it, but they saw me out there putting myself in front of what was going on to better the enterprise. And it was amazing the interpersonal relationship that I started to build with our team. They're like, we do hard work, you do hard work, you're one of us. And that changed the whole dynamic on the inside. On the outside, what we started to get a reputation for was doing creative things. And when you have why can't public agencies do creative things? I don't know. We did. And as soon as that happened, someone like Mark Kim, absolutely stellar financial mind from New York City, was encouraged to come down and join us. And we started getting tremendous talent coming into what had been a sewer agency that nobody liked. And when Mark Kim got there, we started racking our brains, or what are all the financial innovations and create that we can do to lessen costs to ratepayers? And so part of it is straight financial, and the other is to encourage and to expand on this reputation we have of innovating about everything. If it's procurement, if it's paperwork, if it's technology, we want to be at the cutting edge of everything. And I'd asked him, what about longer dated debt? Could we stretch this out? I thought he might go 40 or 50 years. And I remember when he came back, this is a debt, usually municipal debt is 30 years, 20 years in that range. He came back, let's do a century bond. A green certified century bond. So it was the first independently green certified. So we didn't certify it ourselves. Sort of like someone saying it's green. No, we had a separate entity that was based in Europe because there were none in the US at that time, certifying that this was for green purposes. And it was for a maturity of 100 years. And what I never knew, Willie, is how exciting finance could be. Because I was in Goldman Sachs office.
You like looked at me and said, that Walker guy, I don't know what the hell he does during the day. I mean, he seems like a guy here for the job, but he does is so boring.
It was nerve-wracking. I was sitting in the office looking out over the steam coming off, and I didn't realize the book runners, I mean, in the old days, and we set the price that morning, not knowing if anyone would buy a century bond. And they turned around and we were oversubscribed. And it was like this back and forth all morning. What was going to be the basis points went down by 16 basis points, which saved our ratepayers even more money over time. And again, what it told to all the people we served is that we were creative. We were doing everything we could to save money to our ratepayers, which was part of this whole package of what we were delivering to the people we served.
So as we're talking about innovation, obviously doing a century bond was huge, and I want to get to the digester in a second. But there were some things that you talked about, how you garnered leadership, how you garnered respect, how you gained the respect of everyone at DC Wassa before we went and rebranded, and we ought to talk about the rebranding as well. One of the first things that I remember, and to those listening to this, you got to remember, I already told you at the top, George is a Princeton undergrad, Harvard Law School graduate. I mean, if you want to talk about any type of elite education, George is this elite white lawyer who has come in to run a utility. And so he walks in with, I mean, a lot of skepticism as it relates to who is this guy? What's he going to do? How are you going to do it? There were a couple of things that you and I did, George, that I think kind of changed the tone a little bit. And I'll just start on sort of two that I did, and then I'll tee you up on one that is very evident, and then I want you to talk about a couple others. But there used to be a reserved parking spot for the chairman of the board, and I had them rip the sign out of the ground literally so that there was no reserved parking spot for the chairman, so that I would come and find a parking spot wherever I could find a parking spot. There was a special office behind the boardroom that was for the chairman's use. And I said, that's for anybody on the board to use whenever they want to use it. And at least from a board perspective, I tried the best that I could to just sort of get rid of the perks and sort of say, look, we're trying to run this thing efficiently. I'm not here because I want some big title or some great parking spot. I want to make a difference, and I want to do what's right for the taxpayers and for the community. The most notable thing that you did when you first came in was you started wearing a DC Wassa shirt, and it said general manager on it, and it was a white shirt, and you wore it every day. And I remember the first time you walked into a board meeting, I looked around and there were these other board members who in many instances were elected officials in counties around Washington, DC. And they looked at you sideways. They said, hang on a second. General manager of DC Wassa wears a coat and tie, a suit, is a white collar worker. And you basically said, watch me. Talk about that for a moment.
Sure. It is one of my favorite memories of DC Water, and I miss it, wearing that shirt. Very sort of teen trial boy. But one of the things I think about leadership, Willie, is most of the good ideas don't come from, I won't speak for you, for me, most of them weren't mine. What I thought I was good at was recruiting good people like Mark Kim, but also seeing a good idea and knowing it when I saw it and adopting it quickly. So we had a uniform shop at DC Wassa, which I did not know. This was still in the DC Wassa days. And this older woman was in charge of it. She was kind of irascible, but with a very warm heart underneath. And she came in one day and said, I've given a uniform, the standard issue uniform, to every GM who's come in and no one's ever worn it, but I'm giving one to you too. You should wear it. She was like wagging her finger at me. And I remember looking at her going, okay, I'll wear it. I'll wear it for a day. That's what I thought. Because she'd come in and talk to me directly. So I put it on and wore it the next day. And what I was not prepared for was the sensation that it caused inside the utility. And to me, changing organizations are teams that are working together, are encouraged and enthusiastic to a common end. And my team, the people we depended on to change, were all of these veteran folks who had worked, and most of whom are blue collar, in the field, fixing pipes, doing all this. And they needed to be as enthusiastic as I am and as you are. And the question was how to build that rapport. And as soon as I saw the response, I'm like, oh my gosh. A, I like it. I feel good in the shirt. I feel like I am part of the team, but B, it's working. It's gaining me a connection to the team that I didn't have otherwise. And it became a symbol. I would go to places and people would say, you better be wearing your shirt, because it sort of became part of the whole thing. My wife thought you should wear a blue shirt, because they were blue shirts and white shirts with the name. And this looks like my kids told me I look like I worked at a gas station. And so I asked this woman who I'd see in the hallways, can I have a blue shirt? She goes, no. I'm like, really? I'm not a very imperious GM, but I would have thought I could get a blue shirt. She goes, you don't do blue collar work. Only if you do work in the field do you get a blue shirt. And I love that. The spirit and camaraderie of the folks who do it. So I used to herald the fact that the blue shirts and the white shirt. I wear my white shirt, but I know who does the work in the field. And that again was another step. But it's something I would testify in Congress, wherever I went, wearing that shirt symbolized to me what we stood for and who the people are. I would talk a lot, present all the rest, but who are the people who are actually doing the work that embody DC water? And they're folks wearing this shirt, and that's why I wear it too. And I miss it. I felt part of the team just by putting it on every day.
I still have my chairman of the board shirt. Sits right up in my closet with a bunch of other nice stuff. So we decided to rebrand. The DC WASA brand was something that you and the team thought we needed to move beyond. We've told listeners that when we both stepped into this role, DC WASA had a pretty awful reputation in the DC area. And the idea was, let's go rebrand it. Talk for a moment about that, because you and I could have very easily gone into a back room, pulled in your head of marketing, Alan, said, hey, Alan, what's the new name going to be? The three of us could have sat around and come out and we'd done something as far as a board proposition or whatever else, and we could have gotten it done. But you took a totally different tack when you came to me and said, I think we got to rebrand DC WASA into something new. Talk for a moment about how you underwent that and why that participation was so important to the launching of the new brand.
Sure. And I'm glad you asked the questions in the sequence you did, because my realization that we needed a rebrand stemmed from wearing that shirt, because I had the old logo and the old name on my shirt. We had a water main break in Adams Morgan, a part of DC, and I was walking home because I lived in Shaw that night. It was a Friday night. There's a lot of water main breaks in the evening because that's when people use the most water. And someone walked up to me and tapped me on the shoulder. He said, I've always wanted to work for you. I don't know if you've ever heard this story, Willie. And I said, really? What are you interested in doing? And he goes, I've always wanted to work for the Department of Corrections. That is no joke. That is what he said. And I remember looking, I was like, what? But I looked at our logo. I don't know if you remember the old days, DC Water and Sewer Authority. This is a patch on the corner of your shirt, so you can't read any of it. The letters are too small. The tagline was 2 sentences, so you couldn't read that either. It was red, white, and blue, and it had a helping hand over water. But I'm convinced that they look like 2 hands in a handcuff. I don't know. I'm not sure. But what I did know is that this guy could not tell from the uniform that I had on who I worked for. So our 600 trucks, they were doing work all over the city. No one knew it was us. No one. Why would someone write out a check to us if they don't see their money in action? So I thought we should figure out a way to make ourselves easy to identify and present our case to the public. And thought, well, why don't we don't have a lot of budget for it, because that's another thing you and I had to do carefully, was to really manage every dollar, because there's a lot of folks who are watching you to try to see if you slip up along the way. So I didn't want to spend a lot of money on it either. And we did a public contest. And we got funding. We had 156 entries. And Alan Heyman, who is our very capable head of external affairs, again, recruited to bring in some of the new talent that came in. That epiphany I had gone through, we don't need dark red, white, and blue. We're an environmental organization. and I remember presenting it to you, Willie, when we presented these ideas, and you were the one who immediately said, absolutely, let's go for it. It's DC with a water drop. So there's very simple logo. The water drop's tilted a little bit to make it a little more formal, bright environmental colors with a tagline, water is life. So my view is if someone 5 years old sees a DC water truck, they'll know it's DC, they'll know it's water, and they'll have a sense of its importance of any age, or as soon as someone, even if they can't read, oh, I bet that's water because of the water drop. And so that was our technique to do that. I vividly remember the day we presented it to you because you were so close, held your decision close to the vest. And Alan and I didn't know how you were going to come out, and we're very stoic as we presented. And in the end, you said,
nobody who works with me, George, no one who ever works with me to say I'm close to my vest and that I'm stoic and all that kind of stuff. I say that in great jest because that's you're describing me all too well as I'm trying to make a hard decision.
Well, I've seen you animated, but when you were evaluating what we were presenting, you were being very serious and going through, we didn't know where you're going to come out. And then you said something, I love it. And we had that event sitting out in front with the mayor and everyone else when we pulled down and we again did it on the very inexpensively. We didn't logo all the trucks until they were coming in for maintenance otherwise. So how could we at every step reduce the cost of this transformation? But it's simply one of the best things we've done. It's now a logo that's known worldwide, and it had all sorts of benefits. One was our team. We're an environmental organization. I remember when I went back to talk to our crew, I said, I had an epiphany. I really think we're the most important environmental organization in the city. And I remember visibly watching our folks sort of sit up in their chair. Because when you're work in a place like DC, it's something you feel inside. You've just never heard anyone say it before. All you've seen are the articles in the Post telling the story of how we poisoned people and all these terrible things we've done. And now we were presenting ourselves. We are environmentalists. We are cleaning the Chesapeake Bay, the largest freshwater estuary in North America. And we're the most important element. And you are the people doing it. And the customers who are paying into it, you are enabling us. And it was, again, all part of these factors that came together to build the enterprise that we became.
So there are two other things to the transformation that I think are important for people to hear. The first one is you got to be in the trenches. And you and I are talking about a lot of highlights of our time, but you mentioned the water main break. You and I on Friday nights at 1:00 in the morning, and it's 22 degrees outside, would show up at a water main break where the team is out there in the middle of the night trying to resolve the problem. You and I both went to people's houses where sewage had backed up into the house given some problem. I got phone calls from residents of DC saying, you're terrible and you're awful, and why aren't you guys doing better things? And there was a time where you and I got into we were brought in to work with the fire department on a very, very, very unfortunate fire that happened inside of DC. There was a lot of finger pointing between the fire department and the water authority as it relates to sort of who is culpable for it. Some very significant lawsuits that came out of that. I raise these issues, George, because in hindsight, it looks all great, and under your leadership, DC WASA was transformed into the very best water utility in the United States. And talking about changing uniforms and rebranding and all that kind of stuff, and the leadership you provided every single day, in hindsight, all sounds pretty straightforward and relatively easy. And what I just think is so important for people to understand is this was all done in the context of a brand that could not have been worse, and therefore brought the ire of many, many people in the DC area. And you and the team did an incredible job of transforming that image. And it's not just changing the brand, it's everything that happens every single day with every single repair, fire hydrant, pipe, the water, everything has to happen at a certain standard of service that allows you to transform that brand. But then also just the bureaucracy with which we worked under. I remember distinctly you and me sitting in that hearing with the fire department across from us. And it was all like, let's get to the bottom of this thing and let's all figure it out. And then all of a sudden the politics started to play in, and it was very much fire department versus water utility. And we'll see who wins here. And it was scary, to be perfectly honest with you. In hindsight, it was scary to be sitting there saying, we're all part of the same government. We're all part of the same enterprise. And we're trying to do the best for the taxpayers and for the citizens of District of Columbia. And then all of a sudden the knives come out And you're like, oh, well, maybe not. Maybe somebody's got, their interest ahead of yours. Maybe someone's afraid about a lawsuit. Maybe someone's afraid about a promotion. And so I think it's important for people to understand that, there is an underbelly to all of this stuff that you so effectively led through on a day-to-day basis with your team, which allowed for this process to actually happen. And it sounds great. It's almost like you could write a book about it, but there would be a very thick chapter if you and I went back and wrote about this, about all the political challenges, let's just leave it at that had to be overcome to make this transformation actually successful.
Well, I love that you've raised the point, because I think it's an important message where our country is now, because there was no magic for how we did this. It was old fashioned, straight on. And by the way, again, why I give you such credit, it gave us so much credit that not only was the GM of the enterprise showing up at these events and being transparent and accountable for issues that were our responsibility, but the board chair was right. It would have been easy for you to duck those. Other board chairs in the past had done that, but you were there. You were front and center. You were as a board member, and then me as GM, we were taking straight on the issues that mattered to the enterprise. And that's, again, something that people see and was completely different than what they were used to. And what I found, because you're right, there was a lot of grueling blocking and tackling. Remember all the various council members from wards, that particularly Ward 3, as I recall.
One in particular, yes.
Who were just just waiting to pounce on you because they could get a whatever in the political world. And I think what we did, and this is a message, is it worked to be direct, to be honest. If we did something wrong, we owned up to it and figured out how to fix it. If we didn't try to call other names, even though I think we were pushed that because we had other folks, I think, inappropriately trying to finger us for things. We stuck to the record. We stuck to what the story was. And here's what happened. Here's why it happened. We understand that. And the good news is that even in a city where the politics is as tough as DC, it worked. But it did take that retail grueling, you run to the battles. You don't shy away from them. You don't duck them. There's a problem with, I'm going to go into his office, sit down, just like we did in the wards. And so did you. And we'll sit right in front of you and talk to you. What's the issue here? And if they say something that doesn't seem correct, we'll try to correct the record. Here's what we think happened and all the rest. And it wasn't 100% batting by any stretch of imagination, but we were productive enough. And again, it added into this whole sense of DC water's really different. When I'm a council member and I got a problem, they come into my office and ask me what the issue is sitting in front of me, or admit if there's a problem and try to fix it. And their board chair will visit if need be, if there's a hearing, sit right there. That was just a whole mindset change. And then for your ability to help the board, because we made a lot of tough decisions that the board had to support us on, the credibility that you gained in the same way that I gained it with my team, that you gained with the board, being willing to go out there and stand up for the enterprise in a thoughtful, a substantive way, I think meant that at both levels of the enterprise where we had to be sync, like we'd never seen before, we started to really be productive. And that was real. It was hard. It was right. There's an underbelly that was tough work, but it was great to see the outcomes that came.
So final kind of story, anecdote, or decision that I think is so telling was the digester. And so people can get a sense of this. When you bring all this water into a wastewater treatment plant, you basically separate the solid waste from the liquid waste. And what we'd done at DC WASA prior to building this digester was that solid waste would be taken out of the water and would be put in dump trucks, and it would be sent out to the rural fields around the greater Washington area, and it would be sprayed onto crops and used as fertilizer. That was just the way it was done. The transportation of it was wildly damaging to the environment. If you think about the just truckloads and truckloads of dump trucks that would take all this waste out, and then we would be spraying it onto crops, which was perfectly fine from an environmental standpoint. But that solid waste has a lot of energy in it. And so we'd started doing a study to see whether we could build a digester, which would take that solid waste and it would burn the solid waste and turn the solid waste into energy. Blue Plains, which George said previously is the largest advanced wastewater treatment plant in the world, is also at that time was the largest point user of electricity in the DC area. So think about all the other things that have to run in the DC area. Blue Plains used more electricity than anything else there. And so the idea here was to go and invest around $300 million to build this digester, which would take the solid waste, burn it, and turn it into electricity so we could have a closed loop. And George told you previously that we had a $3.2 billion consent decree from the Justice Department that forced us to go out and issue debt. We had $1 billion on trying to change some of our effluents into the water. And now we were going to add another $300 million on top of that. And he raised the issue of managing the board and the board's expectations, et cetera, et cetera. And every board member came from a different county, that came from a different state, that had a different view of financial management and risk management. And I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, George, but you remember very, very well where I got in a big debate with one of our board members as it relates to our investment strategy and trying to put a certain amount of our reserves into bonds. And this board member sat there and said to me, well, what if they pay off early? And I won't even go down that. But the point being is everyone had a different view from a financial management standpoint. And the digester was something that the board was vehemently opposed to, because it was going to cost us another $300 million when we had $4.2 billion of other obligations we had to go fund. And you and the team were out trying to push through rate increases that were going to be able to pay for what we already had on the table, much less than an incremental $300 million. But you and I got through the board the digester project and we built it. Talk for a moment, if you will, about two quick things. One is just how transformative having a digester and doing the closed loop was. And then the second thing to it, which I think is the most important piece to all of this, is that the digester, when it actually got built, and there was a front page article in the Washington Post showing the digester up and the closed loop and all the great things about it, the two people who made that happen, George Hawkins and Willy Walker, were nowhere to be found in that photograph. There was a new mayor, Adrian Fenty, who put me there and put you there, was nowhere to be found. The council members who you and I had to work with to get support on it were nowhere to be found. And what it said to me at that time, George, was if you really want to do great things in public service, you got to have people who don't care about being on the front page of the Washington Post to get credit for what gets done. And all the time when I think about our election cycles of congressmen and women in the United States for 2 years, I say, by definition, they are all short-term oriented people who can never, ever build a digester. They can never sit there and say, it's going to take us 5 to 7 years to go build this thing, and then we're going to reap the benefits of it. And the people who are in leadership positions in 5 or 7 years, I might not even be close to them, will get credit for it. And the problem with our politics is that everyone who is in an elected position wants the credit. They need to be on the front page of the Washington Post, which makes them only do short-term projects rather than doing longer-term investment projects. And that picture, which I actually still have in my scrapbook, where you're not in it and I'm not in it and Adrian isn't in it, says to me that that's one of the key problems with our governance of our country and municipalities and states and cities today. But I've gone off on a different tangent.
No, I would say two things. One, actually, you haven't given yourself enough credit. That was a $470 million.
We're 7. Okay. No. When you get into these billions and all that stuff, it gets a little bit of a rounding error, but I wouldn't say that to any ratepayer. And by the way, I think you clearly articulated, we were very focused on expenses, very focused on efficiency, and very focused on being great stewards of the enterprise. So I don't say that flippantly of saying a couple hundred here and a couple hundred there, but the bottom line was it was a big expense that we quite honestly at the time had a lot of board members who thought we couldn't afford it.
It was discretionary. I mean, this was a project that was not mandated. It was something we decided we wanted to do. And by the way, just to give a flavor of the scale, the sludge, this is the sewer sludge that we're taking out of the waste that we don't want in the Chesapeake Bay, the Potomac, and the Anacostia. We were generating 1,200 wet tons of biosolids every single day. 60 tanker trucks, and these are big trucks, were coming in and out of the site every single day. And as Willie said, that's energy in that. that we can use. And DC, as most utilities, by the way, anyone who's watching this, you're in your community, probably the biggest energy user in your community is the water utility. Why? Carry a gallon of water around. It's really heavy. And imagine moving millions of gallons of water or wastewater, because we were doing both, drinking water, wastewater, all over a city. We had a $37 million power bill overall at DC Water. So the biggest power user in the mid-Atlantic, for God's sake. So the question of how we could generate, and I won't go into all the details, but this was again a perspective that you were able to help change the point of view of the board. Because even though it was $470 million in total, not all at once, that was broken out. The first bond was $300 million because that was the first initial cost. But the savings were so great, not having to do all those trucks, now generating power on site, now buying less power off the grid, that it was cash flow positive over time. So the savings that we were able to generate with this project was more than the debt service that we issued. And that was what changed the mind of Anthony Griffin and Tony Firestein, Tim Firestein, and all the people we remember well. And it was a different way of looking at how to do capital budgeting. It's one of my favorite stories at DC Water. And it's one of the things, again, you helped with this perspective. I remember we would divide up our capital program into categories. And one category we never used to fund was called Better Business Practices. And you'll remember Len Benson, Willie. I remember asking Len, what's in that category? Because we never fund it. And he goes, well, that's the projects that would make us more efficient to operate. But because we're doing all the mandated projects and all the rest, we never have any money left over. I'm like, but that's crazy. Because if we do those projects, we will permanently be more efficient and more effective, and we will always be able to do more. So we started asking ourselves, this was a Mark Kim innovation, all capital projects had to have a return on investment business plan associated. Most public agencies don't do that, but there's no reason why they can't. And it changes the decisions you make. We spent more on biosolids up front, but knew that the cost of service, that we were going to save money each year forever into the future. And I can't remember when the crossover was, when we paid ourselves back, and then it was all positive. And that was, you're leading the charge, me presenting very carefully what we would do, change the mind of the board. And that's what's possible with a public agency. You can do those kinds of projects, even at higher cost, if you start thinking life cycle, return on investment, ratepayer invest. The toughest consumers are ratepayers. And we could tell them, yes, this is being invested in, but it's going to save money to them. Actually, our budget is going to be better off after we do this project, not worse. And then into the future, it's just going to get better and better and better. And that changed the decision on what was a groundbreaking. That was the first time that technology that we adopted at DC Water had ever been used in North America, and the largest installation to this day that has ever been built in the world, and is the cleanest and greenest sewer sludge project ever devised. And it was done in a way that cost more money up front. So if you hadn't thought of it in a different way, we never would have done it. It took a different mindset to get there. And you were absolutely part and parcel to having the board and the staff think of it that way.
That might be your epitaph on your tombstone, George. The what was it? The largest and greenest sewer sludge project ever developed. It came up your tongue perfectly. I have to tell you, it was really quite something. I could keep going on this, and you and I haven't even gotten into where the water industry is today and water and all that great stuff. I think we're going to have to do a part 2 because we are out of time on this first one. But the story of DC Water is something that I'm wildly proud of. I got as lucky as I've ever gotten in having Adrian Fenty whisper in my ear, you ought to be looking at George Hawkins, having a group of people who helped me make the decision to bring you in as the leader, and the team that you assembled around you, and the way that the board and the management team and the entire enterprise at DC Wasa turned into DC Water, which took one of the worst utilities in the United States and turned it into the #1 utility in the United States. It's an incredible story. And I'm just super thankful for A, having been part of it, B, all that you have done, and C, for the friendship that you and I developed throughout it. And I hope that people who've listened today got a little bit as it relates to, both what it takes to get these things right, and then also some of the trials and tribulations from a leadership and general management standpoint that one must endure and lead through to be the successful leader that you were on this transformation.
Well, bless you, Willie. Like I said, this was a team effort, and you were absolutely part of it. It could not have happened if we had not had you as chair, I don't think, because of the number of things we looked at differently, and you helped us look at differently. But for the folks watching, it's a story of what can happen in the public sector. There's nothing we did that other agencies across the country can't do and should do, because you can deliver better service to your customer. You could buoy their sense of what the government can actually do their job, do it well, and serve you well. And I think the country needs those stories, and they absolutely are possible. And it was a blessing for me. It's a highlight of my whole career, and for another time. But what I'm doing now in this organization is trying to help disadvantaged and low income communities do the kinds of things we were able to do at DC Water. That's why I stepped down, and that's a story for another time, because it's fairly shocking, some of the realities of the water systems in our bare country that we all rely on every day for everything. But Willie, yes, wonderful friends, an incredible partnership. Who would have guessed? And
Exactly.
it shows what was possible, and I was blessed to be part of it.
Well, thank you, George. It's been a pleasure for me to run down memory lane with you. Thank you, everyone, for listening today. And we'll see you again next week for another Walker Webcast. Thanks, George.